Good evening and welcome to a new edition of To The Point. This evening we'll be looking at Egyptian-African relations. Where are they heading? With us in the studio is Dr. Marwa Mamdouh Salim, who is a researcher in African politics. A pleasure to have you with us.
A pleasure is mine, thank you.
Before we go into African-Egyptian political relations, we would lead our discussion with maybe one of the critical issues that Egypt is facing right now, which is the water issue. With us on the line is Dr. Mohammed Sameh Hamr, professor and chairman of the law department at Cairo University. Dr. Sameh, can you hear us?
Yes,
a decade of conflict, and a question raises itself right now. Can we resolve the issue in any way? Can a legally binding agreement be drafted right now to resolve the Renaissance Dam issue, in your opinion?
Definitely, any agreement can be reached, and this issue can be resolved if there is a political will at the side of the Ethiopian government to reach a balanced, binding agreement between Ethiopia and Egypt and Sudan. The problem that we are facing is that Ethiopia has no political will to reach the agreement, despite all the diplomatic efforts that we have went through the last 5 or 6 years. Our experience showed that the Ethiopian government is not willing. And if there is no will at their side, it will be extremely difficult to reach an agreement. How I can reach an agreement with a partner who is not willing to agree on a basic terms and conditions that reflect the principles of international law. That's the real problem. And that's why Egypt successfully referred the matter to the Security Council. Because if Ethiopia will continue in their behavior, negative behavior, and insist not to reach an agreement, and insist to fill the dam, then what Egypt can do? Egypt has exhausted all the diplomatic efforts, and we have a resistance, a very clear to everyone from the Ethiopian side, not to reach an agreement. So Egypt cannot continue in this process that shows that the Ethiopians are not ready yet or not willing to commit themselves with the principles of international law related to use of international rivers. Yeah. And that's the real problem that we are having now.
So, in your opinion, what should be the next step? I mean, the issue was addressed at the United Nations Security Council. Majority were against Ethiopia's unilateral actions pertaining to the second filling of the dam. What should be the next step?
The next is we are waiting now for the outcome of all negotiations that are taking place currently at the level of the Security Council. Tunisia has submitted a draft resolution that reflects the need of the Egyptian and Sudanese side to call on Ethiopia to stop the unilateral filling of the dam, to reach an international agreement or a treaty to regulate the filling and the use of the dam in the future, and to find the right forum internationally that can guarantee some observance from the international community of the negotiation process. So we are waiting now for the Security Council. I'm sure that there is a kind of deliberation, and I'm sure that the draft resolution will be discussed, and we hope that the Security Council will carry its responsibility in order to ensure that stability in the East Africa will be maintained. That the continuation of this situation by the Ethiopian side is really threatening international peace and security. You cannot give a state, the upstream state, the right to hold or release the water from the downstream state. So there is a bit of a struggle there. And when we go to the Security Council, we go to the Security Council in order to help us.
Yes.
This effort by the Egyptian government was followed by the visit of the Minister of Foreign Affairs to Belgium yesterday, who met with many ministers, European ministers, and who met with the President of the European Union. And the European Union has issued yesterday a kind of an announcement to support the position of Egypt and Sudan. So it is now the international community should take an action and put all the kind of a political pressure on Ethiopia in order to ensure that we will be able to resume negotiation in good faith, a constructive negotiation that lead to adoption of an agreement by the three countries. If Ethiopia won't do that and will continue in its negative attitude, I believe that Egypt also will have the right to go back to the Security Council, and the Security Council should escalate the measures that can be taken against Ethiopia in this case.
Dr. Sameh, some parties are saying that Ethiopia stems from strong foreign support. How will this play in the United Nations?
Unfortunately, this plays in the United Nations. I mean, if some of the big powers are supporting Ethiopia, this can be an obstacle to adopt a decision by the Security Council under Chapter 7.
Yes.
So, and they will use the veto power to stop any adoption of any decision to be taken by the Security Council. And this is the problem. And the Egyptian the Egyptian Minister of Foreign Affairs and the team of the diplomats should be in direct contact with those states in order to show them the amount of threat that can be faced by Egypt, and to explain the whole situation. So through this negotiation, I hope that those countries or those states will reconsider their position and not to encourage Ethiopia to act in a unilateral way against Egypt and Sudan. So this is a heavy work that we still have ahead of us, but I'm sure that Egypt has a plan to continue its efforts. Egypt cannot stand in this position without taking any positive action and wait for others to decide for us, because this is a matter of a livelihood of more than 100 million Egyptian people.
Yes. Dr. Mohammed Sameh Amr, thank you very much for your fruitful input. Dr. Marwa, when Egypt was the chairman of the African Union, President Sisi was adamant on building strong relations with the continent. He had extensive diplomatic visits within the continent. The tension that Ethiopia is creating right now, what will this do to not just Egyptian-Ethiopian relation, but we're a continent that is very rich yet very poor, and we should all be consolidating efforts to ensure that we can move forward, we can match the pace of global reform. How is this affecting that?
Well, very sophisticated question, but I will try to address it in a clear way. As you have just mentioned, Dina, Africa is not a poor continent. by virtue of its natural resources. Putting into consideration its young men and women, you know that more than 60% of African population are under the age of 25,
Yes.
which is a huge capital resource. But instead of trying to allocate all our resources towards peace, security, development, let alone foreign intervention, something that is called in the literature the new scramble on Africa. It is true that now Africa is liberated, Africa is independent, but what we call it neo-colonialism, or the new scramble on Africa, because of these rich natural resources, adds indeed more burden and more challenge on the shoulders of the African nations. So I assume that with all these challenges, the ideal situation is that what once President Kwame Nkrumah called Africa must unite.
Yes.
Actually, we should unite. We should try to avoid any differences, which is, of course, sometimes not possible. But at least when the source of differences appear, the rational wisdom is to try to contain it. That's why Africa raised the slogan, first of all, Africa for Africans. This is number one. Number two is African solutions for African problems. So,
And that's an important slogan.
of course, so when we add more problems to the already existing one, I cannot imagine that this will help any of the African nations. It is like a kind of win-win situation. When we unite, when we work together, when we make the best usage of our resources, then we can start or continue actually our path toward development. But I really feel astonished.
I'm not propagating the theory of the conspiracy theory, but since 2011, this part of the world,
Yeah.
the Arab region, suffered tremendously under the so-called Arab Spring.
Yeah.
And some are fearing that some parties, and I'm trying to be very diplomatic here, are trying to instigate trouble, extending it even further, deeper into the African continent, to continue the spring. But maybe this time it will not be an Arab Spring, but an African Spring. What do you think of this theory?
Conspiracy theory exists in international relations studies, indeed. And let's look at it from the other side. It's not about only conspiracy, it's about realism theory in international relations. I mean, every country in this world seeks its national interests. And the room for morals and ethics in international relations is very limited. So generally speaking, I am not surprised to know that there are actors, be them regional, be them global or international, whom we call hegemons, who seek their national interests, even if these national interests will cause destruction or will cause wars and conflicts and pain and suffering.
Yes.
And this has been, unfortunately, the destiny of Africa since centuries ago. When you look at the slavery history, when you look at colonialism, when you look at the severe struggle for independence in the 1950s and in the 1960s, and Egypt was part and parcel of this struggle of anti-colonialism and anti-imperialism. So as I told you at the beginning of this episode, it's another form of scramble on Africa.
Yes.
And let me put it also in a clearer way. These foreign and external actors, they have a direct benefit and interest in dividing the continent.
Divide and conquer.
Exactly, Dia. So creating conflicts and not only triggering it but exacerbating it, and trying to limit the chances of solutions and of peace building and of settling these conflicts is indeed pouring into the profit and the interest of these external bodies. So this is a very, very general thinking. Mm-hmm. If you want us to give examples, then I leave it to you.
One of the issues that are not being addressed when we talk about the Ethiopian problem is the Ethiopian people. Ethiopia has a lot of internal issues.
Yeah.
Can or will the Ethiopian people allow their government to isolate them? Because unilateral decisions eventually lead to some form of isolation.
If you wanted to understand, in my opinion, the position of any nation towards its government, look at the narrative of the government. What kind of justifications the government of country X, let's not talk about Ethiopia or any other, we are talking about, as I told you, a general kind of example. So the narrative of the government, the speech which the government give to the people is that we are poor, we need development, this is our resources, and nobody has the right to share these resources with us. So go to a poor people with no electricity, with a lot of needs with regard to development, and tell them this narrative. What do you expect? Go to a hungry person and tell him, here you are, this is the food, but the other big country want to take your food. What do you expect? So it is about what kind of justification and explanation the government is giving to the people. Perhaps if the situation exacerbated, like Dr. Amr said, and the Security Council, for example, if the crisis increased and Security Council started to adopt severe measures, then the people may understand that no, the situation has another side to look at. Mm-hmm. But by the way, it is very important here to emphasize that Egypt has never ever been against the right of development of any nation.
Yes.
And on the contrary, I remember here, and I want to recall our mentor, great late Dr. Boutros Ghali.
Yes.
Dr. Boutros Ghali, peace upon his soul, in 1981, which is 4 decades ago, launched what is known by development diplomacy through embracing or creating a fund called Egyptian Fund for Technical Cooperation with Africa, and this was 1981.
Yes.
I'm just giving you example, by the way, because the examples are zillions.
They're endless.
Dr. Ghali, he was the first one to introduce something called the Undogo. The Undogo means brotherhood. And this was an initiative calling the Nile Basin countries to cooperate together and to fulfill integration and to try to find a kind of cooperation in electricity, sharing, and these stuff. 4 decades after this, or less than 4 decades, in 2014, and particularly in Malabo Summit, the AU summit that took place in summer 2014, Egypt introduced what is now known by the Egyptian Agency for Partnership for Development, yes. EPAD. So how can a country, and another examples on a bilateral level of cooperation, sending experts, sharing the know-how.
Yes.
For example, a stunning example is the dam which Egypt is building in cooperation with Tanzania, the Nyerere Dam. And long time ago, we had the dam with Uganda. So how come a country is allocating a huge part of its know-how, expertise, in order to embrace cooperative and developmental policies towards its continent? How can anybody claim that this country is against the development of a other sisterly nation, let alone that the other country is a member in the Nile Basin, I may call family? And I want here to tell you a short story. Yes. Perhaps it's important to look somehow into history. By the end of the 1990s, Egypt engaged in full good intentions within what is called the Nile Basin Initiative. And a marathonic negotiation process started in 2002 or 2003 under the sponsorship of the World Bank and other international donors in order to negotiate about what is known by the Cooperative Framework Agreement. There has been years of negotiations, and a lot of flexibility was shown by the Egyptian side. And this excuse of what they call the colonial agreement and this kind of, sorry to say, blah, 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 because these colonial agreements, if they call it like this,
yes,
is simply contradicting with the principle adopted by the OAU, which is the Organization of African Unity in 1963, to respect the international agreements demarcating the borders between the African nations, despite the fact that these borders were decided by the colonial powers in the Berlin Conference in 1882-1883. So, is it a double standard measures or what? If the African countries, long time ago, for what purpose? For the sake of peace and security. Because I want you to imagine, Dina, that in 1963, instead, and here is the answer for your question, instead of launching the huge dream of unity, which the founding fathers like Nasser and Nkrumah and Nyerere and others,
they came up with the first concept.
So, exactly, instead of launching this dream embodied in the OAU, instead of doing this, they kept discussing and negotiating and disputing about the borders.
Worth noting, a concept which was launched in our continent and applied by others.
Exactly. So you cannot now pick what you want from international law and leave the rest for your own thinking or for your own, picking what serves your objectives and leaving what you think that it's not going in parallel with your intentions and with your objectives. So I hope I responded to your question.
Can we talk about any progress in this continent with conflicts like the water conflict, like terrorism, like colonialism? Can we really talk about moving forward with this so-called rich continent, because you are very rich in natural resources and in human resources? You have a continent where over 50% of its population, young people,
right,
our neighbors in Europe, are suffering due to the lack of youth. And you're blessed with human capital. Can we move forward on any front that way?
Well, the prominent proverb says, whenever there is a will, there is a way. But provided that there is a political will. The challenges are huge, are immense, in fact. And challenges are coming from outside and from inside. Those young men who should be considered or who are already an asset for this continent can be also be a bomb when they are recruited by the radical and terrorist groups, like what we see in Sahel.
Happened.
Like what we see in Sahel. Last week, if I'm not wrong, just a few days ago, another dramatic incident of kidnapping over 150 of young men from the schools in Western Africa and Nigeria. They are recruited simply by the terrorist groups, and they never return back, by the way. We have, this is the 7th year of the Chibok girls incident, or Chibok schools incident in Nigeria. The girls did not return back. So the problem is that it is a kind of double-edged sword. Having this huge number of young men and women in Africa is a huge asset if you provide them with education, with healthcare, with employment. Then they will indeed contribute to the development of the continent and toward the better future of the continent, either politically, economically, socially, to the end of the list. At the same time, if you leave them in air, in space, then simply you give a huge chance and opportunity to other groups, particularly the terrorist groups, to play on their griefs, to play on the tone of the injustice and how they live in poverty. And then they use them to destruct the continent. So back to your question, yes, it is possible. Indeed, when you look to the continent in the 1950s, and you see that it was only Egypt in early 50s and few other countries, not more than like 6 or something, that were free. Today the situation is not like this. But today we have other challenges. In the 80s and 90s, we had the challenge of economic challenges and structural adjustment programs and combating poverty and debts. Now the challenges are terrorism, and add to it internal differences and internal conflicts created by some African countries themselves. So we need a real conscious, a real awareness, either from the side of the African people themselves, or from the African governments and states, that together we are strong, that Africa must unite, that we don't have the luxury of differences now. We already have our share of problems.
Can we have African solutions to African problems, or do we not have enough political will by some parties in the continent?
Theoretically, yes. Theoretically, you can indeed have African solutions for African problems, and you have a very promising platform, which is the African Union. The African Union has passed through a dramatic, important transformation by the end of the 1990s, at the beginning of the new millennium, and by the help of whom we call neo-Africanists, like at that time Thabo Mbeki and other very well-known African leaders, the OAU was transformed with stronger mandates and stronger capacity to intervene for the sake of peace, security, and development, compared to the situation on the level of the OAU. So after this transformation, the AU now should be more capable to play a more influential and more effective role. Provided that, we should not forget the fact that the AU as a body is composed of member states. Okay, so again, we are
reflecting the political will.
It is a kind of a vicious circle, you see, my dear.
What about the United Nations? I mean, is this another test for the power of the United Nations to resolve conflicts?
It is. It is. With no hesitation, of course. But do not forget that the United Nations itself and the Security Council in particular, is, how can I say this, is in need for continuous reform process. So the UN itself is always trying to modify itself, and there is a huge debate in the academia and even in other circles about the reform of the Security Council. What about the right of some countries and some continents that were not active in the scene after the Second World War, because the UN was formed right after the Second World War in order to respond to the needs of the world order at that time. And some actors were not at that time existing in the scene, and that's why there is a huge debate on the right of Africa to have a permanent seat in the Security Council, for example. So what I want the point I'm trying to raise here is that the UN indeed itself is under a debate of the necessity to be reformed, and it is a test of how it will respond to the voices of other nations that are not permanently represented in the Security Council, let alone the issue of the balances, the power balances between the 5 permanent members in the Security Council, which Dr. Amr mentioned in his speech. So, as he just said, we are waiting, and we will see what will happen in the future based on the very important step which Egypt did by taking the entire file and raising it internationally in front of the United Nations.
Prospects to move forward. What's the positive angle?
Can you put the question in another way?
We want to end it on a positive note. How can we get our act together and move forward as a continent, in your opinion?
By really believing in the fact that either we win together or we will lose together. There is no unilateral result here, unilateral winning here. And that we have to share our sources. When it comes to the Nile water issue, Egypt here is really defending a right to live. This Nile has been a source of civilization, of the first African civilization, by the way. This Nile is not only a water source. This Nile is a component in the blood, in the genes of the Egyptian, in their culture, in their economic practice. And if we are coming to an end now, I find it a very nice and representative sentence written in the Book of the Dead that tells you how the Nile was very precious to even ancient Egyptian. Let me read it to you very quickly. It says, "Happy, the water flow, papyrus and lotus spring up. Egypt will be fed. Men who have slept in the dark with stomachs empty at night, happy to eat in the morning. Nile flood, in the towns there is a festival of flowers." A country which its civilization is based on this precious gift from God cannot ever show any tolerance towards any efforts from any other side to deprive it and its people from the right to live.
Will the Egyptians allow it? We have over 100 million in population here.
Egyptian people are very smart. They love peace. But at the same time, you will not feel surprise when you see them paying every and any price for the sake of their lives. And this is our right. Nobody can claim anything against this. And at the same time, I would like to emphasize that Egypt has always been and is and will continue to be in the back of the sisterly African nations. History says this. It's not me claiming that. Egypt has never ever attacked anybody in its history, extending arms to everybody, either in our mother continent or even to other parts of the world. So I am sure that in good intentions, there is a huge opportunity to really reach a peaceful settlement for not only the water problem, for any other
conflict.
Any other conflict, any other, I will call it difference. I would like to hope that it will be contained as some differences. I really hope that it will not escalate to the level of being a conflict. And I'm here actually leaning on the wisdom of African governments.
To resolve all kinds of conflicts.
Exactly.
And move forward.
Exactly.
On that positive part, I'll end our discussion. Dr. Marwa Mamdouh Salim, thank you very much for joining us this evening on To The Point. I'd like to wish you a very happy Bayram.
Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank you, the viewers. Wish you a very pleasant evening, and we'll see you same time next week. Until then, good night.